For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Sashni Mudli. Author Martin Platt joins me today to discuss his book, Promise and Despair, The First Struggle for a Non-Racial South Africa. Can you tell our viewers a bit about yourself, from growing up to where you are today?
Well, I was born in Cape Town and spent the first 27 years of my life there. I went to the University of Cape Town and then to the University of the Witwatersrand. And I was there in 1976 with the Soweto uprising, in which I played a very small role, but I mean we demonstrated in fact 3 times, and you know, it was a terrible moment, and I think everybody who was there remembered it. Then I went to the University of Cape Town and I was again involved in some of the demonstrations in June '76, after which I left for Britain to continue my education. I was going to come back, but I fell in love, stayed, and basically then worked more or less continuously for the BBC on Africa, for the BBC World Service, and then began writing on Africa, and this is one of the books that I've produced.
Can you briefly explain what Promise and Despair is about?
Well, essentially what happened was that during the Boer War and before the Boer War, the British promised black and coloured people that they would receive something in compensation for their support. And generally the communities did support the British because they thought that the British were less repressive than the Afrikaners who were fighting the British. But after the war, it turned out that it was not possible. The British decided not to intervene when a delegation, a non-racial delegation, comes to London in 1909 to contest the claims of people like Botha and Smuts that South African would be reserved essentially for whites, that only in the Cape would Africans and coloured people have the vote. And this delegation, a non-racial delegation, in fact led by a white former Cape Prime Minister, W.P. Schreiner, but bringing together people from across the communities, came there and to try to contest this. The British didn't support that position, and for a variety of reasons, one of which was that they knew that the First World War was coming up. They desperately needed the white community to be on their side to bring South Africa into the First World War on the side of Britain. And so the promise was the promise made during the Boer War. The despair, in a sense, was the abandonment of the commitment that Britain had made. And it was a tragic mistake, because everything that unfolds in the 20th century in South Africa, up to and including apartheid, comes out of that decision.
Tell us the inspiration behind the title of your book, Promise and Despair.
Well, in a sense it was partly, it's the subtitle really that was the inspiration, which is the first struggle for a non-racial South Africa. Because for me it was a huge surprise when I discovered that the non-racial vote goes back not to 1994, but goes back to 1853. And I wasn't aware of this when I first started researching this book, and I've subsequently discovered that almost no other South Africans, apart from professional historians, know that the non-racial vote goes back that far, and that people were able to exercise it. It was only a male vote, and it was also a vote which you had to have property or income to get it. But there were 14,000 coloured people and about 6,000 Africans who in 1909 actually had the vote in the Cape. And guess what? Politicians took them seriously.
What were your reasons for writing this particular book?
I was fascinated by this area, and particularly by the characters that were involved. There are some of the most remarkable people I've ever come across. I mean, some of them are obvious, like Gandhi, because Gandhi was in London at the same time. I mean, everybody knows him and knows that what an amazing character he was. And he had his weaknesses, but he was an extraordinary figure. Then you get people like Jabavu, Rubusana, Dube, all of whom are in their own right as great, in my view, as anybody that South Africa has ever produced. Giants of intellect, people who were capable of running almost anything at the time, people of real education and deep understanding of what was going on. There were also people in the coloured community, people like Dr. Abdurrahman, Mr. Lenders, you know, but all of these people were extraordinary figures, and really these people drew me to work on this subject.
Novelist Olive Schreiner had campaigned for the rights of South Africans, regardless of race. You write that on the day the South African delegation was to set off for London to lobby for a non-racial constitution, she made a gesture that shocked white society at the time. Can you tell us what she did and the significance of her actions?
Well, she had been horrified when she watched the final debates in the Cape Parliament. She looked down and she saw people who she thought were liberals, basically, in her view, selling out the promise of a non-racial future for South Africa. And she was completely disgusted by what she saw. Now, her brother, W.P. Schreiner, who was a former Cape Prime Minister, in a sense took a similar view. He hadn't always been a liberal, but he had become one. And he then actually agreed, after quite a lot of pressure, to lead this delegation to London. He leaves on one ship. The next ship, a whole group of people, including people like John X. Merriman and a lot of the white politicians, but also Mahatma Gandhi and some of the black delegations like Rubusana, are on that ship. And Olive Schreiner makes a point of coming aboard and particularly going to shake the hands of Gandhi and Dr. Abdurrahman. She goes up, she talks to them, she discusses with them, and she makes a political point by doing it. And that was really, really significant. And quite frankly, white society was shocked that a white woman would, make the point that that was where her sympathies lay.
Can you tell us a bit about Olive's brother, Wal Schreiner, and his role in lobbying for a non-racial constitution?
Well, he was somebody who had a strange history, because, as I say, he had been a former Prime Minister of the Cape, and at first, for example, during the Anglo-Boer War, he had resisted the idea of deploying black people and coloured people to fight the Boers, because the Cape was invaded by various groups of the Boer commandos. But as the time went by, he actually changed his position and thought, no, actually we do need them, and he began to rely on them. He then travelled in the Eastern Cape and began to meet people one-to-one, and suddenly he saw the light. He thought, these are not just, names, these are real people, and he began to interact with them, and he changes his position. It's a real Damascene moment when he it's a conversion. And as Olive had always hoped that he would come round to being on her side of the argument, and he does. And it is a really extraordinary moment. He then, after the Bambata Rebellion of 1906, he then goes and he defends the Zulu king, who is on trial for his life. He gives up his place in the National Convention, which is when the white politicians are deciding what sort of future constitution South Africa should have. He gives up his place on there to go and defend the Zulu king, because he thinks that is such an important task. And he does it successfully. He's not hanged. And so he then comes back in the Cape. He intervened 63 times in the final debate to try to stop an all-white constitution going through, except in the Cape. He was absolutely opposed to the constitution that was involved. And frankly, the rest of the white politicians were utterly fed up with him. But that was why he had the stature to really lead this delegation, which brought together people of all races in the first time to go to London to try to win a non-racial future for South Africa.
Can you explain the consequences of the Indians, Coloureds and Africans' decision to side with the British in the Anglo-Boer War?
I think in a sense it was an important decision on their part, because what they were trying to show was that they were genuine citizens of the empire. And it's one of the points that Gandhi makes early on in his career. He says, look, in 1858, Queen Victoria promised that she would rule the empire irrespective of colour or race. It's just after the Indian Mutiny, as it's so called, and she promises her subjects that she will be the empress of all her subjects, irrespective of race. And in a sense, that's what Gandhi expected. He expected to be treated exactly the same as anybody else, almost as if the British Empire was like the United Nations. I'm not suggesting it was, but that was the kind of attitude towards it. And every time he came up against this, he was always surprised, or not surprised, but he was always shocked in a way, and he demanded, and so did the others. They said, you know, we want to be treated as equal people. But of course, when you demand equal rights, there are equal responsibilities. So when Britain was at war, then it was their duty to fight on her behalf. And they expected, by showing that they were loyal, solid citizens, that Britain would then give them rights and accept that they were genuine citizens. So I think that's why they took that attitude.
It is widely assumed that the vote was first extended to black people in South Africa in 1994. Can you explain why this is actually not the case?
Well, of course, it was extended to people in 1994, but it wasn't the first time. And that there had been, from 1853, there was a non-racial vote in the Cape and only in the Cape. There was also, in theory, the same rights in Natal, but in reality it didn't exist. I think about 100, maybe 150 people of colour had got the vote, but it was so difficult, it was almost impossible. In the Transvaal and the Free State, it was a white-only male vote, but there was no question of paying. You didn't have to be rich. Anybody had the vote. And when the Cape suggests to the Transvaal, well, listen, we've lived with this non-racial vote for ages, why not go with it? Then Smuts turns around and says, well, I can't sell this because it would deprive 10,000 of my existing voters of the vote because they're too poor. They don't have the land or they don't have the money. I can't go to them and try and sell it. So he then turns around and says, no, no, no. We will stick with a white-only franchise. The Cape can keep its strange non-racial franchise. And that's the division that is agreed upon. But, you know, that is where it comes from. The tragedy is, of course, you then get Herzog, who was even more racist than the positions that were taken by Botha and Smuts. And he is determined to deprive first the African population, then the coloured population, of all rights, even in the Cape. And in 1936, he finally succeeds. And so the Africans lose the vote, and then gradually, of course, much later, the coloured people lose the vote, and then you have full apartheid. So it is a tragedy that that happened. It's one of the very few examples in the world of the vote ever being taken away from people. It's usually the other way around.
There is a chapter in your book called Gandhi, Defeat and Victory. Tell us a bit about Gandhi's campaign and why it was successful.
That's one of the most interesting points, and it's a really fascinating question. Gandhi had tried for many, many years to win proper rights for the Indian population, particularly in the Transvaal. And he banged his head up against the racism of the white administration time and time and again. By 1913, frankly, the Indian population, most of whom were, shall we say, traders, merchants, professional people, they were the bedrock of his support. They were utterly fed up. They said it's like, literally, a man said, one of the people who was quoted, he said, it was like running against a brick wall with my head. It's pointless. And he launches his final campaign in 1913 with just 16 supporters, one of whom was his wife. He was down to his last pennies, in a sense, in support, if you see what I mean. And but he does one thing that he's never done before, which is he turns to the indentured labourers on the mines and in the sugar plantations. And they suddenly see the light. And he sends women, particularly from the Transvaal, Indian women, into these areas, and they appeal to these miners. They come out in their thousands. And he closes down Natal. He also does another thing which is absolutely fascinating, extremely clever. He sends some of his supporters to India to stir up trouble, well, not trouble, but spread what is going on and the vicious way in which the whites are suppressing the strike that's going on. And in the end, it becomes, the pressure in India is so severe that the viceroy comes out in support of Gandhi, which was unheard of and causes a huge storm in Britain, so that the king eventually intervenes on behalf of sort of imperial unity and says, look, really, you can't do this. The empire's got to be kept separate. You can't intervene in the affairs of another bit of the empire. And but Gandhi finally, eventually succeeds. The struggle is so intense that he succeeds, and then in 1914, having got some of the concessions that he was asking for, not all of them, but some of the concessions, he leaves for India and becomes hailed as the Mahatma.
What do you hope people will take away from your book or understand about the struggle for freedom?
I think I would like people to see that the delegation that went to London in 1909 was not the failure that it is painted as. They did not win the concessions from the British that they hoped, but they did gain a great deal. One of the most important of which was that the African members of the delegation, people like Jabavu and Rubusana, meet with a whole group of young lawyers, African lawyers, who are training in London at the time. And as they themselves said, the discussions they held there were the basis for bringing these young people back to South Africa after 1910, and then the formation of the ANC. The formation of the ANC comes directly out of these discussions. And just relating to the current situation in South Africa, one of the key things that someone like Pixlika Iskasema comes out with and says, he says, you know, one of the things we have to bury is the demon of tribalism. And that was one of the lessons they learned. And sadly, we're now seeing some indications of, you know, this rearing its head again. I mean, that in a sense was the issue on which they were all agreed. It was the foundation stone of the ANC, and it's a tragedy that it is now rearing its head again.
That was author Martin Platt discussing his book, Promise and Despair, The First Struggle for a Non-Racial South Africa.